He says that in their desire for material gain, the weak submitted to the domination of the stronger, while the stronger, with the advantage of more resources, made the smaller cities subservient. And so in many ways, this is a double commentary on the claim that might makes right. Because what he's saying is that yes, with more material resources, which we could just as easily here say simply with more techne or technology, the stronger do in fact make the weaker submit. But this is the more important part. The weaker are willing to submit so long as they're able to pursue more material wealth than they would otherwise have had. And that's an astonishing claim, because what it means is that men will give up their freedom so long as they're compensated for that in terms of some kind of more luxurious, or we could even say merely comfortable way of life. Now we have to understand here, this is an at least twofold teaching on human nature. Namely, those who are by nature stronger will in fact at some point exercise dominance over those who are weaker. That's at least one aspect of human nature. And another aspect of human nature is that those who are weaker by nature can always be bought off with the promise of increased wealth or luxury, or in fact, mere comfortability. And now with those two claims about human nature, which is to say those two universals about all men as men, Thucydides has a psychology in order to understand man, and in particular, in order to understand political man. And so he turns again to Homer, because he ends that paragraph by saying this was already largely the situation when they later made the expedition against Troy. When turning back to the Trojan War, Thucydides is going to turn back to Homer, and he's going to use this psychology to understand, or as we would say, to psychoanalyze Agamemnon from Homer. And because this transition back to Homer is so important, I need to be perfectly clear. What Thucydides means when he says this was already largely the situation when they later made the expedition against Troy, what he means when he says the situation there is the psychology that he has just deduced, namely that the stronger will in fact always exercise dominion over the weaker, and the weaker will happily give up their freedoms if it means that they get more material wealth, which is to say more luxury or mere comfortability. And so what Thucydides means when he says that this was already largely the situation when the Greeks made their expedition to Troy, what he means is that precisely that psychology constitutes the critique, or as we might say today, the revisionism of Homer that Thucydides is about to provide. Namely, that those who were stronger due to more resources, or as we would say, technology, were in fact exercising dominion over the weaker, and the weaker were happy to give up their freedoms by simply being bought off. And so with that psychology in mind, Thucydides is now, beginning in paragraph 9, going to engage in a contest with Homer and the poets more broadly regarding the origins and even the greatness of the Trojan War. He says the following: in my view, Agamemnon was able to assemble his expeditionary force more because he was the most powerful figure of his day than because the suitors of Helen, whom he was leading, were bound by oaths of loyalty to Tyndareus. Now, as a sidebar, I need to add that Tyndareus was Helen of Troy's father, and the oath being mentioned here has its origins in some fragments by Hesiod, and there's also reference to it in Euripides' Iphigenia, and there are some other mentions as well elsewhere, but the point is simple. Thucydides is contesting the origin of the Trojan War, commonly associated with Helen of Troy being seduced and taken from Menelaus, who was Agamemnon's brother. And Thucydides is telling us that's an incorrect account of the origin of the war. He's saying, no, the origin of the Trojan War was precisely because those who are naturally stronger exercise dominion over the weaker, and the weaker are easily bought off. And so the stronger, in this case, is Agamemnon, and the weaker are those he bought off to go with him to battle the Trojans. And so it was material wealth that was the bond of their allegiance, and not anything like loyalty or an oath to Helen's father. And so notice the great contrast there. Thucydides is saying no, oaths, or the sacredness of an oath, which would always invoke the divine. That's not what made Agamemnon strong. What made Agamemnon strong was his material wealth and the fact that other men are bought off so easily, which is to say that other men are bought off or bought out of any kind of oaths that they make. Now, let's make sure we understand just how radical this is. In a single stroke, Thucydides has gutted the entirety of the gods from Homer. Just let that sink in for a minute. And remember, this discussion is part of the series I'm doing on technology and nihilism. And so just continuing, he says, according to the clearest traditional account of the Peloponnesians, Pelops was the first to achieve power there, and despite arriving as an immigrant, he gave his name to the place because of the great wealth he brought from Asia, coming to a people without means. And so again, we see the psychology being employed here. Pelops was just an immigrant, not even native to Greece. And yet, because the people of Greece were so poor and he himself was so wealthy, not only was he able to exercise dominion over them and buy off their allegiance, but they flatly named the place after him, the Peloponnesus. And so the very war that this entire text is about, namely the Peloponnesian War, is Exhibit A for Thucydides' proof that the psychology he's deduced is flatly true. And just to finish off that paragraph, he continues by saying, and later, Pelops' descendants were even better off. Eurystheus was killed in Attica by the Heraclidae, but Atreus was his uncle on his mother's side, having been banished by his father Pelops for killing Chrysippus. And it was to Atreus as his kinsman that Eurystheus had entrusted Mycenae and his realm when he left on his expedition. But when Eurystheus failed to return, Atreus took over Mycenae and the whole of Eurystheus' kingdom. He was supported in this by the Mycenaeans, who feared the Heraclidae and also recognized Atreus' abilities and his popularity with the masses that he had courted. And so the descendants of Pelops became more powerful than those of Perseus. Okay, so that's an enormous amount of genealogy going on there, and I won't bore you with the details of trying to explain it. I'll simply say this. Atreus is the father of Agamemnon and Menelaus. That's why in Homer they're often referred to as the sons of Atreus. And so the fact that Atreus is a relative of Pelops, who had initially banished Atreus, means that at least by blood, Atreus is accorded a right of succession to Mycenae when Eurystheus entrusts Mycenae to Atreus, and Eurystheus himself being a rightful heir by blood to Pelops of Mycenae. And so Eurystheus dies, Atreus inherits Mycenae. And what's important about Atreus is that Thucydides emphasizes that he was a skilled statesman, and particularly with regard to courting the masses. And so what all of that adds up to in that paragraph is Thucydides showing us how it is that an immigrant can be so successful as a result of understanding the human nature that his psychology accounts for, that the immigrant can go to a foreign land and be such a successful founder that his legacy is ensured all the way into the name of the entire region from which the place that he founds is only a part. And also, in mentioning both the Heraclidae and Perseus, Thucydides has no recourse whatsoever to the divine. In other words, all of this can be completely explained without reference to the divine and solely with reference to those two aspects of human nature that constitute the psychology that Thucydides is using to understand all these past events. Now here, as a quick sidebar, the same thing that happened earlier is that the translator of the Cambridge edition inserts a new paragraph. But like I mentioned earlier, all of the editions should have the paragraphing that Thucydides himself uses out to the margin. So we're still in paragraph 9. It's just that in the Cambridge edition, this is a new paragraph. And so continuing, Thucydides says, in my view then, Agamemnon, with the combination of this inheritance and his superior naval strength was enabled to put together and launch this expedition less by goodwill than by the fear he inspired. For he evidently came with the largest contingent of ships himself, and in addition supplied the Arcadians with theirs, as Homer has stated clearly, if he constitutes sufficient evidence. In other words, Thucydides is saying, if Homer constitutes sufficient evidence. So Thucydides himself is raising suspicions about Homer to the reader, and he's going to do this again subsequently in other paragraphs. But continuing, Thucydides says, and in Homer's account of the handing down of the royal scepter, he further says that Agamemnon was lord over many islands and the whole of Argos. However, being based on the mainland, Agamemnon would not have held power over any islands except local offshore ones, which in that case would not have been many unless he possessed a significant navy. And it is on this expedition, namely the Trojan War, that we must base our assumptions about what earlier expeditions were like. Okay, and so that's the entirety of the 9th paragraph. And its most important significance is that it's where Thucydides has begun his most powerful critique so far of Homer. And again, notice the emphasis that is placed upon a navy.